The Norman and Florence Brody Family Foundation is dedicated to exploring topics of national and international importance and is proud to support Policy Watch with Doug Besheroff at the University of Maryland. From the University of Maryland, this is Policy Watch with Doug Besheroff. Ronald Reagan, Fidel Castro, Che Guevara, Juan Peron. From the uprisings in Latin America to the end of the Cold War, these leaders and revolutionaries were at the center of a worldwide power struggle. How did such strong personalities shape the last 50 years of world politics? And who are the men behind these public facades? To find out, Policy Watch is joined this week by Georgie Anne Geyer, foreign correspondent, nationally syndicated columnist, and author of Guerrilla Prince, The Untold Story of Fidel Castro. And now, the host of Policy Watch, Doug Besheroff.
Georgie Anne Geyer, welcome to the University of Maryland and Policy Watch.
Thank you very much, Doug.
Foreign correspondent. Now, I've read your autobiography, and without mentioning how far back we're going, you were a groundbreaker.
I was indeed the first woman foreign correspondent in the country, and I went overseas in 1964 for the Chicago Daily News, and everyone said, oh, this must be so difficult for you. I went to Latin America, and usually there were about, 30 men to me, which I thought was about the right ratio at that age.
But wait a minute, let's go back for a second. So, where did you grow up?
I grew up in the south side of Chicago. My father had a dairy business. Very happy child, always wanted to write. Went to Northwestern University, Mexico City College, had a Fulbright to the University of Vienna, and started with the Daily News.
And right away they said, we want you to cover world politics.
No, they said, we want you to cover the society desk in Chicago, which is what I did. And I had a wonderful time and did specials. For instance, one Saturday night, I went to cover a mafia wedding. And I went as a waitress. And, I learned early on, you can do almost anything if you just show a little imagination and a little innovation. I bought the paper told me to do it, of course, but I bought a waitress uniform and shoes, and I walked into the Tam O'Shanter Country Club, which was totally off bounds. They wouldn't let any of the reporters or FBI or police in, and I just sauntered in a waitress uniform.
So how much was this like The Godfather?
It was not very much like The Godfather, except that there was one room, there were 2,000 people, and at one point I almost lost the guys I was supposed to be watching. And then I found this one little room where all the top mafiosos were. I'd been studying their pictures, and I was serving champagne, and so I went into this little room to serve them champagne, and this one little fellow jumped up immediately and pointed at me, and he said, "Don't give us none of that." And I got a little nervous at that, and I backed out of the room. And later I found that the problem was I was serving them the cheaper champagne. But it made a wonderful story. I remember the lead was Gangland went to a party, and I went along for the ride. But that was Chicago journalism. That was the way we had fun with everything.
So you were always a little adventurous about this. How did you end up with your first foreign assignment?
I actually got a small grant, Doug, and I often have said to students that they don't use small grants or big grants. They don't use scholarships and odd little grants in the library that will let you do almost anything in the world, And I got a small grant, and I went to South America, which I wanted to go to. And the paper thought I would be gone for 6 months, and after 2 years, they made me the South American correspondent. And of course, it was a wonderful time for somebody with my kind of crazy attitude, because Fidel Castro was riding high. There were guerrillas in the mountains in Central America and in Peru. There was a lot happening, and the whole world. John F. Kennedy had just, of course, had died, but the Kennedy myth was living on. So I lived in the mountains with the guerrillas and interviewed Fidel, and I loved it. I loved Latin America.
And Juan Peron?
Juan Peron, yes.
And Salvador Allende?
Yes, I knew Salvador Allende very well.
We'll go through all of those, but let's go back to with the guerrillas in the mountains, because in the end, years later, you tried to track down the Che Guevara diaries.
Yes.
But many years before that, you had been in the mountains with a guerrilla group. Tell us about that.
Well, this was in Guatemala in 1966, and it was a big story then, because this is when Central America was really falling apart with these Marxist guerrilla movements supported by Fidel Castro in Cuba. And no one had really gone with them. No one had covered them. So I was able to make contact. I speak fluent Spanish, and I made contact in Guatemala City. It was extraordinarily dangerous because the Guatemalan military was very vicious and just sort of wiped out everybody who got in their path.
With the American government support.
With our support, yes. But really, in fact, it was a terrible experience because you're sleeping on the ground, you're walking through the mountains all night in the darkness. We were surrounded by 3,000 troops, and it was just a miracle, truly, that we got out alive. But it was a wonderful story.
It's wonderful. You describe it in this book.
That picture of me, that's from with the Guatemalan guerrillas.
Is that with the guerrillas?
Yeah, that's with the guerrillas.
Oh, that's fabulous. And
you see how I look? I look like, get me out of here.
You write it so I can say, you do look like a college co-ed with your ski sweater on.
I do.
Was this some kind of disguise?
No, we just put on rough clothes because we knew we were going to be walking a lot in the mountains, and it was really horrible.
It was hours and hours of hiking.
Well, hours, and we were there about 5 days. And then it came a time when the guerrillas were getting very nervous, and they said, we really have to get you out. And then it was a long, long trail overnight. But, since then, I look at the television now or the papers, and there are so many women and very good journalists who are doing this kind of work. I look at the ones who stayed in Baghdad, for instance, and I think, wow, I wouldn't do that.
Well,
but I'm proud of them. I mean, they've really done good work.
And you write about how being a woman helped you.
I really think it did help me. I think particularly when there's only one or two women, because you're not a threat to your colleagues, and you're more like mascot. And we were just great friends, the men in the field and I, just great pals. The only time when they would get angry with me was when I would get an exclusive, like the Guatemalan guerrillas or interviewing Fidel or Peron, and then they'd say, well, I'd go down to the bar in the evening, and I'd hear them whispering, and they'd say, well, she must have slept with Che Guevara. And, I never met Che Guevara, and I don't operate that way, but I couldn't figure out, how do you do that? You say, Che, where are the missiles?
Well, you whispered in his ear.
Whispered in his ear. I'm sure that would work beautifully.
He's become something of a romantic figure, hasn't he?
Yeah, not the figure that I knew from my reporting. I went to Bolivia the winter of '68 after he was killed. He was killed in '67, and went from place to place to where he had been. I talked to his guerrillas, his Bolivian guerrillas who were in jail, and the Bolivians let me see them. And Che was a very cruel man. He was much more cruel than Fidel Castro, ironically. People think of him as this romantic revolutionary, and he was very much of an ideologue, much more of a communist than Fidel was. Fidel was strictly Fidelista, first que mai, primero soy yo. But Che, when he was head of La Cabaña Fortress in Havana, he had windows put in this ancient fortress so he could watch the executions. And people don't see that Che Guevara.
No, we just see a romantic doctor riding on a motorcycle.
On a motorcycle. Trying to save the world.
Now, you describe, we're talking personalities, but in fact, I think looking at Che's experience, you can see in microcosm the forces in South America that were leading to revolution but then failed.
Yes.
Explain a little bit.
You had, in contrast to North America, Doug, in South America and the Caribbean, Central America. You had Spanish-style autocracies with big land holdings, peons, serfs. You still had, when I started, a really almost a medieval circumstance.
This is in the 1960s.
In the 1960s, yeah. And at that moment, there was a big awakening, a lot of it due to John F. Kennedy. I mean, he really inspired the Latins, and it was, to me, a terrible tragedy that he died at that time, particularly for the hemisphere. Then they keep trying everything. They're trying democracy. They tried free trade. They tried progressive military regimes like the one in Peru for a long time. They tried the civil wars in Central America. And now, strangely enough, after all the democratic attempts, you see a wave of going back to the old leftists again. Fidel is still there after all these years. He's 78 years old. He's been there since 59. The new guy, Hugo Chavez, in Venezuela, president, I should say, whom I had interviewed just before he became president. Very attractive guy, but has no idea about economics or anything. But he has money, he has oil, and so he's supporting leftist movements now in the Andes. And once again, you get back to that old, almost Latin curse of not being able to organize themselves.
People say the United States was blessed by the leaders we had at the founding. And as I read your book, and I read about Juan Bosch, Dominican Republic, Salvador Allende, Chile, maybe even a little Castro and so forth. These are men, they're obviously leaders, but they seem to have no ground. They seem to be lost in the modern world.
They're really not of the modern world. They're much more of Sancho Panza, their ancient Spanish world. They're from a couple of hundred years ago. They're charismatic leaders. When I would watch Fidel with 200,000 people in the Plaza de la Revolucion, he was enchanting them with his spell. He was weaving a spell. He was not leading them. He was weaving a spell over them. And they're telling him emotionally that he can do anything he wants. There's also the sense in Latin America that these countries were founded in an evil way because the Spaniards were so terribly cruel to the Indians and so terribly destructive of all these magnificent Indian civilizations. And if you read a lot of the, particularly Argentine literature of the 19th century, they go over this constantly. The seed of evil is in us for what we've done. And so you have really the two Americas that are similar in some ways, but so very different in other ways.
Tell us a little bit about when you met Castro. How did that happen, and what was he like?
Yeah, it was my first night in Cuba in 1966, and of course, I was going to ask to see Fidel Castro. I was having dinner with the Minister of Education and his wife, and about midnight, they leaned across the table and they said, "Well, you're going to have to go back to the hotel. You're going to see Fidel tonight." Even today, even now he's 78 and he's doing the same thing. And it'll start at midnight or 1 o'clock, and then he starts talking, and at 9 hours later he stops talking. I mean, it's incredible when you think that someone can just talk that long. I find it a way of imposing things on you. Now, Arafat did the same thing in Beirut when you'd interview him. It would always be, he'd usually start later, 2 in the morning. And sometimes you'd have dinner with him. And, I didn't like this. I mean, I didn't respect this in any of those leaders. They think, darkness gives them power, a sense of power. And they also like to impose that upon you, that they're imposing their hours on you. And of course I did it because it was part of my job, but I didn't like it. I didn't like it at all. And with Fidel, you couldn't say a word.
Now, you did spend a great deal of time in Central and South America and in the Middle East.
Yes.
Now, those are both cultures where not only a female correspondent, but just a woman in a high responsible place would be unusual. How much of that was that you were a woman was that you were a Western woman, an American woman.
The problems in Latin America were mostly, I was very young. I mean, I was 28 when I went there, and they had never seen a woman foreign correspondent. And, you know, they wanted to go for dinner and dancing. You know, I'm very proper about how I behave in my work and in my personal life. But that was more a problem of youth. By the time I got to the Arab world, I expected, that was not till like 1969, and I expected more problems. And ironically, I found less problems.
Really?
In that age, at that time. Because if you were a Western woman, you were like a third sex. In fact, I had no trouble getting interviews with the Arab male leaders at all. There, I think they really preferred to talk to women. Now, today, Doug, I mean, I'm not going to go to Iran because I'd have to wear an abaya, the black shawl, all the time. And I'm not going to do that. I'm too old. Maybe if I were a younger woman and wanted to see Iran, you're in much greater danger because there's no, I mean, even in Vietnam, there was a feeling that women were somewhat protected and that men were protected. They, at least the Viet Cong, obeyed the Geneva Rules, ironically. But it's gotten more and more dangerous for both men and women, but even more so for women now, as you saw they kidnapped the Italian woman journalist. In the old days, that no one would have taken a woman. They might have taken a man. So it's really, you want, maybe this is the equality
coming back to
haunt us.
You also, of course, interviewed many American leaders during the same period through the Cold War. Nixon, Carter, and both Bushes and Ronald Reagan.
Yeah.
It's been a long time, and we have this particular view of Richard Nixon and Watergate, but he also gets good marks for foreign policy. When did you interview him, and what was that about?
Well, I didn't interview him while he was president. I interviewed him later. It must have been mid-'80s for the Castro book, because he had, if you recall, when Castro came here in spring of '59, and President Eisenhower didn't want to see him, and he deliberately left the city, so he didn't have to. But Nixon saw him at his office in the Capitol, and they spoke for I think, as I recall, an hour or more. And Nixon wrote a very famous memo after that, and I wanted to talk to him about this memo. And what he said to me that day was, he said, he was worth 60 minutes. He said, he was worth 60 minutes. He respected Castro.
Did he?
He didn't like him, and he wasn't taken in by him, but he respected his leadership capacity, and he feared that he was becoming a communist.
On that point, here we always second guess our leaders, and
Oh no, not in the press, John.
I know, but did he make Castro into a communist? Was Allende just a social democrat, and so forth and so on? Without painting too broad a brush, were these guys ever capable of becoming friends of the United States?
No, because they couldn't be leaders on the world stage and be friends with the United States, because the anti-Americanism of their constituents in their countries at that time was too great. And Fidel never had any democratic possibilities. He's a traditional Spanish autocrat. So no, we did not drive them into anything. I mean, we made some mistakes, but we didn't drive them into anything.
And Allende?
Allende was a true believing socialist. Again, he was more ideological than Fidel, and there was no way he was going to become a friend of the United States. And I don't think we killed him either.
Now, all this was part of the worldwide chess game we call the Cold War.
Yes.
And you were present when the President of the United States, I think, first said the Cold War is over.
If there was one moment in my career, Doug, that I remember it was December of 1987, and the new Russian president, Gorbachev, Mikhail Gorbachev was in Washington for a week, meeting with President Reagan all the time. And I thought, not even going to apply for anything. There were like 3,000 journalists from all over the world, and with my good luck that sometimes comes with my days, they called me on Monday and they said, we'd like 4 of you columnists to come over to the White House on Wednesday at 2 o'clock. And I wrote it down, of course, and I was pleased. And I said, well, with whom is it? And they said, oh, it's with President Reagan. So we went in the Oval Office, and he came in, and he was flying. I mean, he was just euphoric, the president. And, of course, we kept saying, he kept saying to us, you know, that it's all over. He said, everything has changed now. Mikhail and I are friends. And we kept saying, but this is the evil empire. This is your evil empire. Finally, he said, no. He said, you journalists, you just don't understand. It's all over. And when I walked out that day, Doug, I looked at one of the, as usual, 3 men and me, and I looked at it, and I was trembling, actually, with excitement. And I said, do you know what? I think we just heard the announcement of the end of the Cold War. And it was. I mean, historians have said that week.
It's time for us to turn to our audience for questions. You have a question?
Yes. I'm Matt Dessler on the faculty of the Maryland School of Public Policy. Ms. Geyer, we've all been much enlightened and entertained by your stories of the meeting with various foreign leaders, and obviously you were trying to get information from them. What I wonder is, over your career, you obviously accumulated a lot of knowledge and expertise. Did people in our government or any of these other leaders try to get information from you? Did they try to get you to inform or advise them ever? And if so, did you feel you could, or would that be inconsistent with your role?
Yeah, no, that's a very good question. Yeah, the answer is yes. For instance, in the Middle East, when I was covering it, for instance, the PLO in Beirut or in the 1970s, the embassies could not meet with Arafat. They were forbidden to meet with anybody from the PLO. And, we were all friends. We'd have lunch together, dinner together, and they'd ask, the journalists, well, what was it like? What did they say? What was their position? And I have no problem with that whatsoever. It's a discussion like we would have here, and anything I had that was important I would already put in the paper. So it was mostly questions of nuance, and moods, things like that. Often here and overseas, foreigners, the ambassadors here even, will ask me, well, what do I think about our American policy, and how important is some person in the administration or something. And of course I talk to them. I mean, I don't deal in CIA secrets. I deal in interpretation. And there's some people who are very stiff about that and probably would disapprove, and I think that's very, very silly. We all live in a social world. If I have an exclusive story, I'm not going to tell it to another journalist. So it's just common sense, really.
Hi, I'm Karen Logan. It's my understanding that you were held captive for a short period of time in Angola. Could you tell me a little bit about it?
It was 1976, and I was trying to cover Africa for my column, and was able to get into Angola. They let some journalists in when they were having some mercenary trials after that first part of the Civil War. And after a few days, I wanted to leave, but the so-called government, which hardly existed, had my passport. And finally one night I was at dinner at the roof of the hotel, and the manager came up and said, oh, Miss Geyer, they're here, they have your passport. Well, I went down to his office, and instead these guys hustled me out the back and down to this old Portuguese prison by the waterfront. And that was the time I was really frightened, because when they opened the door, when they opened the trunk, they had my things. They'd gone through my room and had everything packed up. But when they started to question me, I didn't burden them with the knowledge that I also spoke Portuguese. And it's interesting, because once you can communicate with people, you're not afraid, even though anything can happen. And I hit upon a ruse. I mean, it just came naturally to me. I guess because I'm from the south side of Chicago. But I started to say they wanted me to tell them whom I'd spoken to in Luanda, and I hadn't spoken to anybody. There was nobody to speak to. But I said, well, I'm very embarrassed about this, but before I left Washington, the State Department took me aside and they brainwashed me. They told me everything to write. And I said, everything I've written here, I wrote from them. And so they used me as a kind of model to these young boys, these poor young kids who were in uniform. He said, you see, that's what the Americans do. They say they're journalists. And they began to lose interest in me. And then they let me they let me go on the plane to Paris in the morning. And my final unworthy thought was that I had already bought a ticket at black market Angolan money, which was about $30 to Paris. And my final unworthy thought was if I hadn't bought that ticket, they would have bought one for me.
Let me thank you, Georgie Anne Geyer, for being with us on Policy Watch here at the University of Maryland. Thank you very much.
My pleasure. Thank you, Doug.
This program was produced by the University of Maryland, which is solely responsible for its content. The Norman and Florence Brody Family Foundation is dedicated to exploring topics of national and international importance and is proud to support Policy Watch with Doug Vesheroff at the University of Maryland.
We are PBS.